Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is welcome to our last regular Irish Studies Research Seminar for this academic year. It's a great pleasure for us to have as our visiting speaker for this session Professor Enda Delaney. Many people will know Enda, formerly of this parish, before he went off to greater things at the University of Edinburgh, where Enda is now the professor of modern history and Director of Research at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. Enda, as I'm sure people know, has published very widely in many aspects of modern Irish history, in the history of Irish emigration, the Irish community in Britain, on the Great Famine, and is now, just a few months ago, brought out an extremely important and heavyweight, just feel the substance of the book, Making Ireland Modern, the transformation of Irish society and culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. So Enda's going to talk to us today on an aspect of Making Ireland Modern, specifically the cognitive revolution in modern Ireland, 1850 to 1920. So Enda, it's great to have you here.
Right.
Over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Peter for the invitation, and great to see so many friends here. Use that cliche, my journey in history started here with my PhD in economic and social history, and then subsequently joining the School of History before I left for more temperate climates in the east of Scotland. If you've ever been to, you'll know that's a lie. As Peter indicated, I'm going to draw on the book, but I'm going to draw out some elements. I got in touch with Peter recently to say I'd done 5 book talks, and I was getting quite browned off doing the same book talk. So could I do something different? He very graciously said, yes, if you're keen on doing that, go ahead. And so this talk really connects some of my work from that book, but also work that I'm doing on the sort of history of cognition. The holding slide doesn't actually have an awful lot to do, but I like it, so I always stick it up. This is, I think, well, maybe it does have something to do. The Ireland for the Irish, the representation of the west of Ireland by order of Yankee Ireland are despots, these Simonized figures, being ungraciously trying to shoot their landlords or their land agents. And then the other Irish, which is Belfast Works, loyal and prosperous, Ulster. And really what I'm talking about is how you move cognitively from that to that over a period of time. So there's been a lot of talk about Ireland's revolutionary moments, from the devotional revolution of post-famine Ireland, the political revolution of the early 20th century, in which British colonial rule ended in most of Ireland, and even the liberal revolution that's brought about such dramatic social and cultural change, particularly in the South since 2000s. Historians often focus on these moments as inflections that mark a discontinuity or rupture. And we know from looking at other Anglophone historiography that revolutions are very much in vogue, whereas the American, Russian, Mexican, and so on. But what about a revolution that doesn't have a start or doesn't have an end? And really, that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. This is a quiet revolution that most historians have not even noticed, yet alone explored its origins and significance. It's a soft ripple across an otherwise turbulent sea, to mix up some unfortunate metaphors. And really, what I'm trying to do, and often when people say this is a work in progress, I always go, oh, that's it. I'm not putting in a disclaimer in the first. And this genuinely is a work in progress. And I am actually looking for ideas about how I can shape this up into a coherent argument. Or maybe even someone to say, forget about it. There's nothing in this. And, if that's the case, so be it. So what then is the cognitive revolution, and why is it important? It's centered on how ordinary or everyday Irish people, in essence, non-elite, made sense of the world, and how that changed over the course of later 19th and early 20th century in Ireland. We know this was an era of profound change in the Western world, and these processes occur not just in Ireland, but in many other places. And there's debates about how this is essentially a Eurocentric framing, which we can sort of mention, but not necessarily go into. So the most obvious issue for me is, how can historians accurately assess what non-elites were thinking about? They don't have archives, they don't have big caches of letters, or private, volumes of writings that we can look at. Few people had either the capacity to record their thoughts or indeed the hubris to record similar sort of musings. So these are the people I'm interested to sake of argument using the Irish translation, the people at the bottom, lower orders proletariat, who feature in the book that I mentioned. This is one image, and this is a controversial image because its provenance is uncertain, but this is held by Sean Sexton, a London-based collector. You probably have seen it. It's been all over the place, and Fergus pointed out to me it's used in the ad for the Irish Famine exhibition in St. Stephen's Green, of all places, shopping centre. Anyway, so that tells you about sort of commercialisation. There's another image which you may be familiar with, the open-air mass in County Bunlan Bridge in County Donegal. And essentially, what I'm trying to do is to say, how do these people make sense of their world, and how does that change over time? So this draws on the book that Peter very graciously mentioned, Making Ireland Modern, where I try and ask some of these questions, although within a wider frame. And it also builds into the current project what I'm doing, which is not on Ireland, which is looking at the sort of history of cognition. So there's a sort of shorthand definition. Cognition is how people make sense of the world around them. That is a process that we all do every day. We don't have the same resources to look at the history of cognition as we do other topics. For example, if you're looking at cognition today, you might look at fMRI scans or things like that. Historians don't have that same ability to do that. But one way which I'm going to argue is by looking at material culture and saying, what does that tell us about how people thought about the world around them? Just to sort of map out what I'm going to do is look at some elements of material culture, then look at interiors and how they change and what that means for how people make sense of that world around them, and then look at some of the buildings which popped up in post-famine Ireland. Another element which I'm going to mention, it's a bit of a sort of is everyday technologies, and everyday technologies are basically things which might seem very sort of standard or ordinary, but are increasingly important. And some of the 19th century Ireland, and she says that the cognitive changes by which the 19th century ideology of rationality with its linear and colonial thought patterns gained ascendancy over a vernacular cognitive system in Ireland, especially after the famine. So really, I'm going to sort of riff off that or take that idea and see to what extent can that actually be teased out in a historical, with a historical approach. If you've dipped into the book, you know that I have an unhealthy interest in railways and railway stations. The reason why I'm interested in railways in particular, because I see them as sort of conduits of communication. But it's worth reminding ourselves of the changes that occurred, particularly in Ireland from the mid to late 19th century as the railway network developed. And there's a great quotation, not from an Irish context, but from Eastern Europe context, where someone says that every time I see the railway, it reminds me of the world that I'm not engaging with, or the world that I'm not being part of. And I think that's another sort of, if you take buildings, but also development of sort of railway infrastructure right across many parts of the country. This is Kingstown or Dunleary Station in just south of Dublin. One particular case study that I really want to sort of drill down to and mention is the language shift and cognition and what that means. So basically, to summarize lots of literature that other people have written, is over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, Ireland experiences, as I'm sure you all know, a major language shift from Irish to English. The sort of statistics and all of that I discuss in the book, but I think no one doubts the language shift. But what does that mean for cognition? For within a reasonable short period of time, for people to be moving from one language to another. And there's all sorts of debates, which I don't want to bore you with, about why Ireland doesn't become a bilingual society, as many other European societies does during this period. But I think it's important to think about when you're thinking about how people, what's distinct about the Irish case is the shift from speaking Irish to English over the course of a relatively short period of time. And what's interesting for historians is not so much the growth of English, but the steep decline in Irish speaking over a number of generations. I think in other national historiographies, that change would occupy a far more central position than it does in Irish historical writing. The argument that's put forward, and this is really from sort of the heyday of sort of 1970s, 1980s, is essentially that it's a pragmatic choice, that people make pragmatic choices for their children and their grandchildren, and therefore the decline of Irish. One of the things which I do in the book is I sort of challenge that, drawing on work by historians like Gareth O'Toohey and Neil O'Keeson, where it's not just a pragmatic, it's about the status that's accorded to the language. Irish becomes the sort of, as many of you will know, the sort of language of poverty, particularly by the late 19th century, and really two fairly significant groups, despite paying lip service to Irish, don't see it as part of their identity. The two groups will be sort of Catholic middle classes and also the Catholic Church, and equally Irish nationalists. While paying lip service to Irish, these are Anglophone movements. But also, I think it's not just the use of the Irish language, but the sort of culture that goes with that language in terms of sources of knowledge, cultural reference points, all sorts of music, dancing, and storytelling. So while the language shift, which has been well documented, is important, but it's also the cultural world that changes as a result of that language shift. So where does this lead us in terms of cognition? Well, I think one major shift is from an oral culture, that's what Angela Burke is discussing. The Gaelic culture was predominantly, but not exclusively, an oral culture, had a strong manuscript tradition in some areas, but many of sources of knowledge are passed from generation to generation through that oral culture, whether it's cures, the information about natural world, ancestors. There's some great, if you've ever, highly recommend that you people here, if you go through the Ordnance Survey letters, and one of the things which comes up, and these are collected during the 1830s and early 1840s, right throughout the country. And one of the things which comes up on this is the importance of genealogies. The genealogies, which of course are passed from from one generation to the next. Now, naturally, some elements of this world will lend itself towards reformatting and adaptation, retrofitting for the new times. But what about the modes of thought, the ways of conceptualizing the world, the differences between the meaning of a word in Irish and its English translation, obviously famously at the heart of Brian Field's translation. And again, I think it's features in Maggie O'Farrell's book on land, which is about the Ordnance Survey. So much of this is well known, and it's framed in terms of cultural loss. But since what has disappeared did not fit into English and Anglophone frameworks, is there a world that, in a sense, that is lost as a result of this? Good example here, in addition to language, is time. One of the reviewers for the book, very, I don't know if it was kind or unkind, said I had an unhealthy obsession with time. And the reason why I'm interested in time is because time, as we all know, is a social and cultural construct, and how in rural Ireland in particular, and Sean has written about this as well, rural Ireland in particular, how notions of the economic value of time are promoted over the course of the 19th and early 20th century. And even in the early 20th century, when the Congested Districts Board inspectors are going along the west coast of Ireland, thinking about how can economic development be promoted in the west coast, one of the things which comes up with extraordinary regularity is these people have no sense of time. And what they mean is they've no sense economic value of time. And anyone who knows anything about the sort of work rhythms of the west coast of Ireland will know that largely most of the work isn't done in the winter. It's done in other periods of time. And it's a constant thing about, if these people were working all year round, wouldn't this place be great? And this, of course, fits into arguments that have been advanced by E.P. Thompson in his famous work on work-time discipline, but also the American historian Herbert Gutman. So it's probably hard for us to imagine in today, in where we have a hyper-accelerated sense of time, but people mark their day in many societies, not just rural Ireland, by the natural rhythms. There's a famous, when I say famous, I mean famous in a very small, in Thompson's article, where he opens with discussion of Singh's description of being on the Aran Islands and the islanders chasing him around, asking him the time the whole time because he had a timepiece. And what we see, I think, is again an example of where the value of time is promoted, and in a sense there's a sort of cognitive shift that goes into that. In the book I discuss, and I won't go into it in great detail, how the national schools play a really important role in that. The background is the national schools are established in the 1830s. They take right across the country. They take quite a while to get some traction in terms of attendance and so on. I look at the textbooks. It was a centralized system, so there's textbooks for the schools. That didn't stop individual teachers doing what they wanted to do, but also drawing on work of Boylan and Foley. And one of the things which they show is how the sort of values of industrial capitalism are promoted during in many of the textbooks that are used in the national school. There's a really good example of that, and perhaps a shocking one in some ways, where one of the exams in 1847 asks about, you have to gasp, what is the value of a corn merchant within society? Now, you might think at that particular time, corn merchants might have had a bad rep, but apparently not, because they kept the market going and were very good at regulating and making sure that everything. And there's lots of these sort of subliminal messages that come out through these textbooks. So, language, time. This is is obviously in the news recently. It's the 1911 census, and the reason why I show this, is because that's actually my great-grandfather. And he was an Irish language enthusiast involved in Conor na Gaeilge and sent his sons to St. Enda. That's why I'm in Enda. But interestingly, when it came to filling out the census, he did so in English. And this is in West Connemara, a place called Lettermore. Yet many of his neighbours chose to fill out the form in Irish, or at least their names in Irish, but he anglicised it. And it showed, I suppose, that sort of tension between the sort of arm of the state in terms of the census and this sort of cultural, national. Interestingly, the only person who can only speak Irish is the sort of servant within the household. Anyway, so this one is get on. Here's some very beautiful boys at the De La Salle School in Waterford doing exactly what I'm describing, using their time efficiently. One of the things it was said about the teachers is that the school day was to be regulated and disciplined, and every moment was to be used for a purpose, a good purpose. And sorry, just moving on to interiors. This is Brian. You'll be very familiar with this. Tully Allen Mass House from the Ulster American Folk Park. The reason why I chose this particular chapel is because of its plainness and simplicity. And anyone who was watching the funeral of Maura Brennan will have been struck as well by how plain the chapel or the Mass House where her funeral mass took place in County Donegal. So keep that image in mind and compare it with that one. This is a Jesuit church, the Sacred Heart Church in Limerick in 1897, and you can see the sort of hugely elaborate, ornate decoration. Many of it, people who know an awful lot about this tell me, influenced by European models in particular, by European Catholic models from Italy and from other places. So Catholic chapels or mass houses were known for their Spartan decoration. Sometimes there wasn't a structure, as we know, but over the course of the other revolution, that's the devotional revolution, the decoration of the new church, the church building that occurred over the post-famine period, and many of these churches, not maybe to the same degree as this particular church, had highly elaborate interior decoration. And you may be familiar about the parish project, which is a joint endeavour between Maynooth and Notre Dame. And what they're doing is they're taking pictures and they're recording all these images of all these churches, which are now being sort of repurposed as nightclubs and various other things during this period. And what they will do when they finish this project is build up this sort of sense of the material culture of Catholic Church. Why I'm interested in it is not necessarily from the decorative point of view, but also the fact, what did this mean what were the cognitive effects of encountering and interacting with crosses, statues, plaques, candles, and other devotional paraphernalia. There's been wonderful work which has been done by the historian of material culture, Lisa Godson, about this is quite a niche area, the Irish Catholic Directory Advertising Register. And on the register is all the goods that are sold to churches right across Ireland. And what Lisa Godson has described is how the sort of Europeanization of this decoration, and then these end up in churches right across the country. So I suppose what I'm saying is, what does it mean going from a Spartan, even intergenerationally, a Spartan decoration of a mass house to these very elaborate structures, and what's this mean in terms of what were the reaction of the faithful to seeing a statue of Virgin Mary or a representation of crucifixion of Christ on the cross behind an altar? So that's one sort of area. The other area which I want to, there's a very good example, just to show that there are other, contrary to Colin Tobin, there are other Catholic churches in Wexford, I'm joking, sorry, I'll come back to those in a second. There's an area which cognitive scientists call distributed cognition, and that's where cognitive processes move outside the mind into the wider world. I don't want to give you a very boring lecture on developments in cognitive sciences, but the key movement in that field has been to move outside of the mind to think about how do things and how do the wider environment influence cognition. I'm going to give you a very quick example to illustrate that, not about Ireland, but it's about naval navigation by a cognitive scientist called Edwin Hutchins. He did an ethnographic study of naval navigators in the US Navy and how they maneuver navigation into often very tight. And what they do is there's sort of shared knowledge that they arrive on. It's not just one person's knowledge, but also they use very visual clues as well. So the type of distributed cognition that I'm interested in are all the sort of paraphernalia that go and material culture that make up the Irish Catholicism from the 1870s, 1880s onwards. People did have things before that, but what did that mean for people to have relics, statues, prayer books, memorial cards? Anyone of a certain vintage in Ireland will remember the sort of memorial card where a picture of a sort of person who's died and then a prayer and rosary beads. So how this fits in, and you might be wondering where I'm going with this, is that the understanding of religion isn't necessarily just in the mind. It's related to all these sort of physical items, and in fact they become a key element in people's religious faith and religious identities. Relics, as Mary Peckham McGray has argued, by female religious relics were a particularly popular sacred item that female religious used to help bind people to the church. So in a sense, there's a notion that it's not just some sort of intangible element, but there's actual tangible sort of features as well. So these were sort of, for want of a better word, technologies which extend religiosity beyond the visual mind into a wider set of artifacts and make up these key elements of what might be called sort of distributed cognition. Another, and this is, you're probably glad to hear, the sort of final element of the revolution I'm thinking about is how people think about the world, or modes of thought, as the politician and journalist A.M. Sullivan, so I'm just going to go back to him for a second. This is Sullivan's famous New Ireland, and he's talking about when he's sort of tramping around parts of West Cork and the people that he comes across. And this is 1877. I'm not building an argument just on the basis of one source, but just giving you a sort of flavour. The Gaelic salutations were few, fine day, talking about sort of Anglicisation. Much indeed has been lost, but much has been gained. And there's an earlier sort of version of this in a work that many of you will be familiar with, in William Wilde's Irish Popular Superstitions. It probably is one of the most quoted elements of that book. It's a footnote in which Wilde talks about hearing from a Catholic correspondent, and he said the tone of society has become more and more Protestant every year. The literature is Protestant, the priests are becoming Protestant, they've condemned all the holy wells and so on. So why that's important to my argument, and people may be familiar with this, is back to what Angela Burke had said about the rejection of traditional forms of knowledge in the pursuit of rationality and reason. All fairly uncontested so far, no one doubts the significance of this, but how does this translate into what might call, as she calls, vernacular cognitive culture? Or to put it more simply, how do people's modes of thought change? And is it possible for historians to uncover those? I'm going to give you sort of three examples to think about. One is the authority and source of knowledge. And a key element, if I can just sort of go back up on my slides, key element is the authority of print. And again, this is not, startlingly original, but how print, the value of print becomes, and the knowledge that print contains, how important that becomes in 19th century Ireland. As I mentioned earlier on, the school books, the role of Richard Wakely in particular, and then there's a sort of program of what might be termed the teaching within Irish Catholicism, Maynooth and other diocesan seminaries based around doctrines, sacramental duties, rules and regulations. And underpinning all of these elements was the role of Anglophone print culture, particularly from the 1870s onwards. You may be familiar with the publisher James Duffy, who made an absolute packet out of all of this from the 1870s. What Duffy did was, he's a very shrewd publisher based in Dublin. He got involved in printing religious works and various. He also printed many of the sort of classics of Irish nationalism. This sort of developing print culture during this period, and of course with that, it tends to underplay aspects of knowledge where their oral culture is embodied in song and storytelling, genealogies, as I mentioned, and even the past. And if you think of Guy Biner's work on how the past is a sort of oral tradition, goes from one generation to another. So one area where is a good example of this, I think, is how a whole system of beliefs and practices based around trying to mitigate the risks of uncertainty of everyday existence. And I'm thinking here of botanical and medical knowledge. The famous example that I'm sure you'll all know is Biddy Early, the sort of potion maker. But this cognitive framework comes under huge pressure from two related developments, as Burke has argued. One is the codification of medical knowledge in print form, which I mentioned already, and the second one is the devotional revolution, first identified by Emmett Larkin in 1972, where Catholic religious devotions were standardized and subject to universalizing pressures. Don't really have time to go into all that, but there's an interesting argument by the historian from late historian of UCD, David Noel Doyle, and one of the points that he makes about Irish Catholicism during this period is how that sort of tension between what he calls the folk and community Catholicism of the west of Ireland and the Anglophone, Anglicised Catholicism associated with the east coast of Ireland, how the Anglicised rules and regulations Catholicism, how that dominates by the late 19th century. The key figures in this, of course, as you'd be familiar with, are Cardinal Cullen, but also Archbishop McHale in June. That's not to say for a moment that these practices did not persist, and what I was trying to show you there was a nice little image from the Folklore Commission of a woman praying at a holy well in County Clare in the 1950s. But the momentum was certainly directed towards Orthodox religious practice, which tended to be based around the church, and it tended to be based around a key figure in the priest. Okay, so the sort of two final elements, which I'll just mention, were how people made sense of the other world. And the other world, this is Bob Bushway, who's a historian of alternative belief in 19th century England, and really proved a great inspiration for me. He said self-reliant and self-aware alternative knowledge belief was a coping mechanism which could deal with the aspect of chance, but was also a source of dignity, self-respect, and self-help. And what he means by that is that this non-codified, non-print knowledge helped people understand their world and their position within that world. And we see this in various different ways across the sort of post. If you're familiar with the novel, sorry, not novel, the reminiscences of Cissy O'Brien, The Farm by Loch Gur, which is edited by Lady Carby in 1937, really there's an interesting tension at the heart of that set of reminiscences. Cissy O'Brien grew up in a sort of strong Catholic farm in Loch Gur in Limerick, and was educated by nuns at the local convent, but she also has an interaction with the world of servants and the people who live in that area. And it's interesting how she describes how the nuns were one of the key groups in suggesting that alternative other world shouldn't be part of sort of Catholic life. So moving from Bushway to sort of final set of speculations, which is about where the individual is in the world. Key element of what people associate with modernization is how the individual becomes more important than the collective. Some good examples of that, I think, are one that's pointed out by Garel O'Toohey, is which people know an awful lot more about the land question than I do here. But one of the things which O'Toole says is that the land question starts as a collective movement. The Land League and reduction in fair, but essentially it ends up in an individualistic solution. The solution is what was called, we're just discussing it before we start the term, but peasant proprietorship. People end up being able to buy particular parcels of land. I'm not for one moment suggesting this is a great example of individualism, but I think it is an interesting way of thinking about it. Another interesting way is seeing immigration, which again is often seen as people who leave post-famine Ireland. Was this an individualistic and hence sometimes, as nationalists said, a selfish act, or evidence of self-preservation of collective, namely the family, where many of the families were built around large numbers of people who would ultimately emigrate? It's interesting that nationalists tended towards the former, especially in the early 20th century. You may or may not be familiar with the fact that the IRA imposes a decree in 1919 banning emigration from Ireland. And one of the reasons why they imposed it was, because they saw that sort of the vitality of the country was seeping out. But also there's, lots of sort of nationalist critics would say that people, they're putting their sort of individual welfare and needs above that of Irish society more generally. So emigration is an inconclusive marker of the rise of individualism, but it does tell us about another element, and that is the widening of worldviews and expansion of points of reference. As I argue in the book, remoteness and the primitiveness of Irish rural society has been overstated by historians to make the move to United States or Britain seem even more dramatic. And I think the book that I have most in mind when I'm thinking about this is Bob Scally's The End of Hidden Ireland, which is about Ballyclacline and Strokestown, that sort of neck of the woods. The way Scally frames it is these people were completely isolated from anything. I think that's a dramatic device which doesn't really work, because there's lots of evidence to show that, especially from the 1840s and 1850s, with the rise of mass migration out of Ireland, that people's knowledge about other places was widespread, and this increased over time. There's that famous quotation from Horace Plunkett's Ireland in the New Century, where he meets a young woman in Galway, and she says, "I'm going to Boston." And Plunkett says, "Well, why don't you think about Dublin?" And she said, "Actually, I know an awful lot more about Boston. I know about what the conditions are, what my family." So I think that sort of remoteness, which it sort of makes for a good story, but I don't think it actually stands up given the sort of pervasiveness of movement outside of Ireland. So what can I sort of draw out of all of this? You may be thinking, not very much. Sorry, this is, I like this image, and I paid enough for it from the National Gallery of Ireland, so I'm going to show it no matter where, because I don't know if you've had any dealings with the Jack B. Yeats, but they're an extortionate when it comes to the rights. This is an image from Yeats in the west of Ireland from 1912. And it's an interesting one because it's, sorry, you probably can't see it. It says a Japanese toy in Mayo, and it has these children. I've every reason to presume that Yeats actually witnessed this. I mean, why would you make it up? And of course, the toy that they're playing with isn't Japanese. It's probably more likely made in Manchester, in mass produced. But it's an interesting scene because I think what Yeats is showing, or at least to me anyway, is these children playing and being aware of the fact that it was actually a Japanese toy during this period. Sorry, I'm going to just say a little bit about intergenerational change and then wrap up. So what are the sort of drivers for change over time? I think family is a key one. If you look at the Irish language shift, you can see that parents play a very important role. You may be familiar with the tally stick. The tally stick was where people, every time they spoke Irish, there was a mark on the tally stick, and then they would be disciplined when they went home. Most famous example of that is actually, in fact, Archbishop MacHale. So the family's important, schooling. I'd say that a lot of the work that has been done on 19th century national schools in Ireland has either been institutional in focus, and there's been lots of great work that's been done on that, you know, the sort of spreading of the system. There's less work done about the sort of ideological import of what the national schools was trying to do. And of course, as you all know, the national schools and indeed the secondary schools become you know, very important elements within Irish nationalism during the period. The irony was that the schools were set up to counter the influence of the Catholic Church in the early 19th century. By the late 19th century and into the 20th century, they're becoming sort of key drivers for the Irish nationalists, particularly for Christian Brothers and other types of schools. Irish language shift, I've already talked about that. Want to maybe just draw one more example from Angela Burke's work. Sorry, something's going on. But the murder of Bridget Cleary, one of the things which, again, you'll know the story about how Bridget Cleary was murdered by her husband and her own relatives because it was said that she'd become a changeling. And therefore, you know, they weren't murdering her; they were murdering the changeling. Anyway, it's a terrible story. But one of the things which Burke does in her book is show how this is sort of sensationalized by the new media. These newspaper reports, which are then sent across. So something, I suppose, this is a good example of where something which I think probably up to this period would have, you know, certainly for the first half of the period would remain quite an isolated incident, is actually sensationalized, and the court reporting right throughout the period. And her husband is subsequently, again, probably well known, is found guilty, ends up in Canada after 7 years prison. So, finally, the good bit, is it possible for historians to explore how ordinary people made sense of the world around them? Well, I suppose that's the question I'm posing to you. A mixed opinion, judging by your facial reactions. So, indeed, should historians be interested in these issues? Which I think is an interesting, it's not can you do it, should you be interested? Is this a revolution or revolution? Perhaps more on the evolution scale. The world that we have lost, that's a famous phrase from Roger Schofield's The Demographic History. But is it possible to reconstruct that world? I mean, much of it's in sources that you mightn't necessarily think of, which I use in the book, for example, the Irish Folklore Commission, but also large number of ethnographic accounts of rural Ireland, that is people going, seeing, describing, and there's problems within that. Inflection moments, what are the sort of inflection points, what are the key moments in this? How important is the revolution, for example, from 1916 onwards in this whole process? There's an interesting quotation from Don Aitkenson, whose work I really like, I should say. But Aitkenson says in his book on the national schools, trying to see if I can paraphrase him accurately, that when the revolution came, at least it was a revolution conducted by literates. Now that's problematic in a number of different ways, because, you know, what if it been a revolution of illiterates? Anyway, but it's interesting, and that was largely. So is there scope for a cognitive history of our time, or cognitive history of Ireland? Let you decide. And of course, it is a story for our time, because human cognition is under pressure as AI and various other, well, AI in particular is I'm trying to think of the right word, is mirroring or simulating many of the elements of human cognition. That's what these large language models do. Okay, you want to leave it at that?
Thanks so much. Very rich paper. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. You can audience online as well, so if you're joining us through Teams, either raise your hand digitally or type a question into the text box. But we'll start with the room. Brian at the back. Brian.
And thanks so much for that. I thought that was really terrific, and you're on to something terribly important. And just to make a suggestion about the problem of measuring the decline of cap doffing, you highlighted the work of Angela Burke, and I think it's generally accepted the most conservative aspect of human behaviour is funeral practice. It's the slowest to change, it's the most tenacious, And one interesting way of measuring the change in this is to look at the newspapers in the in memoriam columns, and just to see how that's taken up over time and how it persists right to the present. And one thing that's very interesting is to look and see the entries that refer to how long do people go on putting in memoriam ads in the, they're not ads, sorry, notices in the paper. And you see them, I mean, people putting in, it's normally the 1st and the 2nd anniversary, maybe the 21st, but you also get 50th anniversaries, 60th, 68th anniversaries.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
Sure.
Thanks very much, Brian. It's a great suggestion. I wonder, maybe perhaps you're alluding to this, one of the key differences, and I'm just sort of responding to what you said, so I haven't thought this through fully, is when you look at that sort of vernacular cognitive system that I borrowed the term from Angela Burke, the boundaries between the living and the dead, I think, are more porous. If anyone's read the work of the folklorist Diarmuid O'Gillan, he talks about this, that one of the key elements is that I don't want to say in a sort of Gothic way that the dead haunt the living, but the dead are seen as part of that sort of cosmos of the living and the dead, and therefore what you're suggesting would be a really good way to sort of track that, how it sounds like a sort of Joycean, how the memory of the dead continues in society and how that sort of changes over time. Thanks very much.
Constantine.
Thank you, that was absolutely excellent. First of all, I'd like to thank you for demolishing that pragmatism argument. I've always thought that was a load of nonsense. There is pragmatism at work, of course, but the natural endpoint of pragmatism is bilinguality, not monolingual English. We have ample evidence for that from the peasantry all the way up to Daniel O'Connell. So if the end result is not bilingualism, but monolingual English, something or someone has to be forcing that. In terms of my question, I would be interested, however, in how do you think, you mentioned newspapers and things like that a few times, but how do you think that shift influences popular political discourse, political mobilization movements, things like that?
Yeah. Thank you for the comment on the Irish language. There's a point in a piece by the historian Vincent Comerford that perhaps hasn't been significantly appreciated. We said the key issue for historians is not to explain the growth of English, but to explain the decline of Irish, because that sort of natural isn't the best word, but the outcome is a bilingual society, and obviously you do get that in parts of Ireland. Newspaper culture, it's a really interesting element because as rates of literacy increase over the course of the period, newspapers, and I think the Angela Burke is she makes this argument. I'm sort of don't want to be appropriating other people's arguments, but she makes the argument that the Bridget Cleary murder and the way in which it's centralized, very much emblematic of sort of developing sort of print culture. And of course, newspapers are key, particularly the growth of provincial newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s onwards in the development of Irish nationalism. Mary Louise Legge has written a really good book about sort of provincial. I guess if I was to sort of speculate on the hoof in response to your question, is that newspapers bring an authority to to print, which I think perhaps more recent times has suffered, and it gives. What I'm trying to say, and maybe I'm not articulating this very effectively, is who decides which sources are more authority, whether it's Biddy Early or curses. There's a great article in Past and Present recently on Irish curses and charms and cures and all of that, as opposed to what you find in newspapers and sort of print authority. I think, and I don't have any evidence for this, so I might be run out of town. I think as historians, we naturally assume the authority of print because that's what we operate in. We see print as being a really important way of trying to understand a particular word. Anyway, sorry, it's not a very coherent response to your question, but it's a really good question.
Maybe I could just follow up on that, and I mean, you've implicitly taken, perhaps more than implicitly, taken 1920 as your endpoint here, because that's the title you gave us.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if that's really too early for
Mhm.
bringing this cognitive revolution to an end. I'm thinking here about Patrick Joyce's work, you know,
Mhm.
Remembering Peasants,
Mhm.
which he came and spoke about here last year. His argument there from comparative study of peasantry, the west of Ireland, southern Italy, southern Poland, was to argue that really the end of the peasantry comes much later, and peasant ways of thinking, peasant cognition, if you like,
Mhm.
in these areas as late as 1950s, 1960s, or even the early
Mhm.
1970s. With a stress, you know, taking an anthropological perspective,
Mhm.
anthropological approach, looking at resistance to official forms of
Mhm.
the imposition of religious forms to urban societies, to forms of governance as well, persistence of orality as
Mhm.
well until much later
Yep.
in the period. So if we don't look at newspapers, but maybe take a more anthropological
Mhm.
perspective, we might actually come to different conclusions about when this
Yep.
cognitive revolution ends.
Yeah, that's a
Is that
really
reasonable?
yeah, no, it's a really good point. I just randomly chose 1920 because I thought, you know, first I didn't want to pick one of the key dates like 22 or 23 because everyone say, well, that's what's that got to do with cognition, which would be a fair point. So yeah, I mean that worldview. I've discussed this with Peter before we start. I have a problem with the word peasant in an Irish context. Joyce doesn't, and he writes a whole book about it, and good luck to him. I think I'm with the argument that was used when K.H. Connell published Irish Peasant Society in 1968. A lot of the response to that was that in Ireland, peasant encompasses such a wide social range of people that it's not necessary. But anyway, we leave that aside for the moment. But I take your point. If you're to lower orders or proletariat, whatever you want to, whatever term is appropriate, because that's what, just on your point, Peter, that's what people are saying in the 1940s and 1950s, is that these sorts of views are coming under very significant challenge from middle class values, middle class urban values during the period, and it's one of the explanations that's put forward amongst many for widespread emigration during the 50s and 60s. Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll suitably reframe. I mean, I guess my sort of is that when you're dealing with something that doesn't have any clear start or any clear end, this is because by the 1950s and 1960s, these are very much values which tend to be very geographically concentrated in Ireland, particularly along the sort of west coast. But there is an inflection point or a tipping point, and I need to work out where that might be.
Yes.
Sorry, thank you. Just wanted to mention the technology device. Think of like the photography or cameras.
Mhm.
Like, do people? It's obvious. Do people like start thinking of how they actually looked? Because the people even have mirrors. Much as I read one time that across the world people had to rely maybe on just a blurry image from a puddle or something to actually have a vision of how they themselves looked.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really good point. The growth of what you might call popular photography. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Erica Hanna, who's written about this. She's particularly interested in collection. I think it'd be fair to say that most of the people that I showed at the very start, would the idea of seeing an image of themselves would have been a completely foreign and dislocating. What you find by the early 20th century, I'm drawing it as a 3-volume PhD on the history of photography that's done in Trinity. Clearly an enthusiast. And he talks about how in the early 20th century, people start saving up to get their sort of family images done, in a professional sort of, in a, photographer's office. And these then are sort of seen as treasured. Other people here will know more about this than I do, but one of the things which certainly by the later part of the period is how people send images to emigrants, of their family and how that sort of develops, because that sort of ensconces in the memory. Yep, it's a really good point about how people understand the self and their sort of reflection of the self.
Sean.
Yeah, it was a really impressive attempt to define the indefinable, or at least get to grips with the intangible.
I'm worried when you say attempt.
What worries me is your third bullet point. Once you start talking about a worldview of loss, create an image. There is a traditional society, and then you start to describe how it falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, historians of earlier periods would have a lot of trouble with that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are people like, like Michelle O'Riordan, who's written about the transformation of Gaelic culture in the 16th, 17th century as people come to terms with massive political change. Before Larkin's devotional revolution, you had John Mossey's Catholic counter-revolution, which he argues turns communal Catholics into individual Catholics. If you go forward a bit, Louis Collin David Dixon talked about commercialization in the 18th century. I mean, there's a great article by Cornelius Bottomer on an Irish poem from the very early 1800s on fair, in which a Gaelic poet writing well before your period is already showing a heightened awareness of the massive consumer goods and the massive commercial activity taking place all around him. So I'm not saying this to undermine what you said, but part of the challenge is setting aside, not just to show that there's cultural change. There's always cultural change. The middle classes are always rising. Culture is always changing. You've got to show that the change that is qualitatively faster and more far-reaching. That is a step change, not just an evolution.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I guess one sort of thing which is quite different is the sort of growth of science and technology during this period. If you think of Osterhamel's great book on the 19th century, the 19th century world, I think one of the arguments he makes about is the sort of pace of change during this period is quite significant. Yeah, how would it compare with other sort of moments of cultural sort of transformation? I think there are some distinctive features during this period. For example, growth of print. If the argument is, do people feel that change in itself is occurring? I probably, no matter what period in history, people will articulate that and say that there's a sort of consciousness. How would it compare it with others? Yeah, I need to think a bit more about. I think there are some quite distinctive sort of features. If you think about sort of emigration during this period, it reaches sort of unprecedented levels that you don't get from the 1840s to 1850s. Incorporation within the Anglophone world, changes in the Irish language. So I think there are some variables which are quite distinctive to this period. But clearly, some of them are of a much sort of longer standing motion. When I say the word we've lost, it's not like an elegy for traditional society. I was thinking when I was writing this, I don't know if anyone's ever read the book by Jim Grace called Harvest. Grace is a novelist. He's talking about the changes in rural England during the 19th century, particularly brought about by sort of the end of the Commons and various other. Sorry, I won't go into all the details. But he elaborates, and I suppose this is where my sort of thinking on this came from. He elaborates, what's this actually mean for people? I think one of the key periods, sorry, we'll stop rambling in a moment. One of the key differences with my period is that it's actually possible to get sources from non-elites during the period, whereas the Michelle O'Riordan and all that, it does tend to be drawn from sort of Gaelic elites. But that's, I need to think about what's distinctive about that particular period. Thanks, Sean.
Purple.
That's great and full of interesting ideas. It seems to me that the way you're setting up this, there's a really interesting gulf between the role played by religion, the Catholic Church in particular, and nationalism as kind of agents of modernity, and the actual values and ideology of the Catholic Church and nationalism. I mean, I'm looking a little bit at Catholic attitudes to modernity in the 1930s, and one of the most popular topics of conversations for a bishop's pastor or a weekly sermon is kind of the evils of modernity. There's a whole worked out chronology of how the world went wrong with the Reformation, which led to the French Revolution and scientific knowledge and all these attacks on secularism and rationality and individualism. And there's a kind of slight parallel with this, even with the sort of the revolutionary nationalist ideology of this post-revolutionary state. It's preaching a kind of return to Gaelic values and so on. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but it seems to me there's a very marked contrast between what you're saying is the role of religion and nationalism as drivers of modernity, the actual values that those religion and nationalism communicate, which is very critical, albeit kind of quirkily define what they define as modernity.
That's a really good point. So I don't know if anyone's got to conclusion in the book, because the problem about writing a long book is everyone puts it down halfway through, but which is fair enough. But one of the arguments I make in the conclusion is that I see it as a sort of troika of sort of Catholic middle classes, the Catholic Church, and which you haven't mentioned is the sort of British state, as because that's obviously unique. I wonder, you know, with the sort of stuff about the 1920s and 1930s, is it because objectively things have changed in terms of newspapers coming from Britain, obviously the growth of Hollywood and all that sort of stuff, and music, or is it because the bishops, you know, feel themselves in a position in which they're able to articulate their opposition to those changes? I don't know if you've looked at, there's a really brilliant book by Stephanie Rains from Maynooth on advertising, and you know, I thought advertising was a relatively recent, but I mean, what Stephanie shows is this sort of historical element in which consumption and consumerism and all that stretches right back into sort of, so many of the things which the bishops are sort of complaining about do actually have a historical pedigree. It's whether they feel that their enhanced status in the new Irish state enables them to articulate their opposition. There are some quite unique factors in terms of music and cinema. But I guess they're sort of decrying those sort of external influences before. I don't know if that's a response to.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly complicated, and the word modernity is actually Vincent Comfort writes really well. I think his book was just on the potential and the invention of Irish nationalism. Modernity is often just meant as a shorthand for foreign things we don't like, as opposed to, you know, all the things that you've been talking about in the sense of the drivers of modernity, which with respectability.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's not. I think 1921 is the significant date in thinking about some of these things, but the political context changes in a way which I suppose changes how people talk about it. There's a lot more prominence in it.
Thanks.
Okay. Eamon and then Marie. Eamon.
That was fascinating. I mean, this is a suggestion about sources. The first thing I thought of, actually, as you were talking, may strike you as a bit unusual, but if you're looking for a narrative of the conflict between rationality based in print and its associated technologies such as dictaphones and typewriters versus a world of superstition and folklore, read Dracula. It's right in the middle of your period. It's absolutely that narrative. But I mean, in terms of non-elite sources, I'm also just thinking, and I'm kind of biting my tongue a bit, but and I say this because I've always stressed the literary quality of autobiography rather than its documentary quality, particularly non-elite documentary. But you can go back to Carleton, obviously Rose Sullivan, O'Crohan, Sayers. But I think particularly in the early 20th century, Frank O'Connor, Patrick McGill, Patrick Kavanagh, all of them, I mean, they emerge into an elite. They become, in a certain sort of way, middle class by being writers. But they're all reflecting on childhoods and the development of themselves as individuals and the development of their forms, their patterns of thought, and the ways in which they are rejecting certain ideas, certain epistemologies, such as those based in religion, and developing their own cognitive skills. And I simply just recommend that as, I mean, I'm thinking of David Burnett, British social historian, who uses the 19th century working class, the early 20th century working class, is not necessarily in the same kind of project that you're involved in, but I mean, sees them as a kind of major source.
That's an excellent suggestion. I mean, obviously I know the work, but I hadn't thought about them in this particular context. And Burnett was involved in that, you know, that huge sort of autobiography of the working classes, which includes a number. Thanks very much, Jim.
Marie?
well, my unhealthy obsession to match your time and railways is censuses, as it becomes a surprise for everybody. I think it's worth looking at the 26 returns to see the people that filled it in Irish. In 1911, of course, while your people had the option, well, they didn't actually have the option to fill it in Irish form, just in England, in Irish anyway. In 1926, it's Oswelga on one side and Oswelga on the other. And the surprising thing is how few people in the Gaeltacht areas are filled in Oswelga. And the director of the National Archives looked at this specifically because she is from the Donegal Gaeltacht, and she was quite taken aback by it. And Eamon O'Quee's answer was possibly that a lot of those people they're Irish speakers. It's very oral tradition, but they may not be as literate in filling form in, and the guard is filling it in, and he's filling it in English. So there's a discrepancy there between the number of people that they return themselves as Irish and English. So if you can speak, there's all these instructions. If you can speak, if you're an English speaker but you can speak Irish, you say English and Irish. If Irish is your main language and you speak English as well, you put down Irish and English. So there's this. I think they were taken aback by how few people who were obviously Gaelboers filled that form in Oswelga. And just the other thing worth looking at for personal effects and things like that is the number of bicycles that people claim for compensation.
Okay.
Civil War. Brian Griffin has a very good article on bicycle, the Irish Revolution. But the property compensation claims, the damaged property compensation, the number is it's like something to believe is the bicycle thief. The IRA are stealing bicycles all over the place during the Civil War, or maybe at least people said they were so they could go to the forts. But I think the Irish speaking, the filling in the census form in Irish in 26 is worth looking at in more detail.
Yep. Thanks very much.
What you do get is the revolutionaries filling it in. You get the Mary Maximinis and the Devonaires and the Desmond Fitzgeralds filling it in Irish to make a sort of a statement. It took me forever to find Gareth Fitzgerald because Desmond had filled it in a very strange version of Irish.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, essentially it's a political act. The interesting, when I went and looked at some of the other people on Lettermore, just that's this island off, connected to the mainland. And it was interesting to also the guards are changing things on the for this census. For some reason, you can see all the sort of commentary. So they're sort of changing things as they see.
They're changing things like for clearly an illegitimate child who is clearly the granddaughter of the head of household has been added in by the house as daughter, and the guards come along and scratch it out and put granddaughter in. Okay,
that's a very that tells you a lot about sort of state and stigma. I saw the piece that you mentioned by Orla McBride about on that. I haven't had the chance to sort of assimilate. I mean, I suppose what I can understand about my sort of great grandfather was they saw themselves as really avant-garde, sort of I mean, they're in the Gaeltacht, they're Irish speakers. Lettermore is still an Irish speaking district. Yet when it comes to the census, they
Maybe some sense as well of English is the language of administration.
Yeah, that Neil O'Keefe has written about this. I'm not an expert in this area, but diagnostic societies where you use one language for your administration and all of that, and you use another language when you're at home. Yep, that's a really good suggestion. I can think about that further. Thank you.
Okay. Anything online? Any questions? No? That's fine. Anyone else have any questions, observations, comments? So maybe I'll just ask another one, and I think this is a really fascinating area. Is it worth asking these questions comparatively about other societies that undergo, say, significant, similar, or parallel changes? Think about Wales here, for example, in terms of language shift and the forces of modernization, or obviously there's work on Brittany and kind of Bretons into Frenchmen and things like that. In this period, is it possible to talk about what is distinct about the Irish pathway of cognitive revolution by opening up the comparative dimensions?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. I mean, the comparative work when you were just saying, mentioning is Eugene Weber's, Peasants into Frenchmen, which obviously is not a gender what we would use today, but that's there's also been fascinating work done in Germany by David Blackburn. He's particularly about Marpigen and the apparitions. I mean, the book is titled Marpigen, but it's actually about similar cultural change in Germany. So I think there are sort of, is just a uniquely Irish phenomenon, which is the sort of bane of Irish historians. So yeah, I think there's possibly scope for examining it but also I think there's scope for examining it with the Irish who leave Ireland. Sort of, okay, it's a bit monotonous, but it is important to emphasize that, for most of the period, large numbers of Irish people are not living in Ireland, and their history is just as important to the history of Ireland and the Irish diaspora, as the people who stay. So one of the things which I do in the book, which is I trace through not necessarily cognitive, but some of the elements across, particularly about religion and other things, to Irish diasporic communities to see if they're a particular sort of difference. Yeah, it's a really good point. I will go off and do the appropriate. There isn't a huge amount written on which that either scares me or makes me really enthusiastic. Scares me because I think, oh, maybe everyone thinks it's a load of rubbish and that's why they haven't written about it. But also makes it, because most of this sort of work, as you can imagine, tends to come from the social sciences rather than necessarily from historians. Personally, I think that's not a problem. Even if many, some of the psychological work obviously is concentrated on individual contexts. But yeah, I could definitely benefit, I think, from comparing with other societies, but also societies in which the Irish settled during this period.
Okay, great. It's been an absolutely fascinating paper. If what Enda said today has whetted your interest, kind of the first draft of your thoughts is in the book, Making Ireland Modern. So strongly recommend that. But there's more work to come. Yeah, this is developing.
Sounds like a threat.
Well, that's what you started off by saying. So I assume there's more work to come in this field. Can we finish by thanking Enda for coming and speaking to us today?
Thanks, Peter.
So just a reminder, we do have one final event this academic year. Our international lecture, which we have every year, will be on Tuesday, the 12th of May. We've got Professor Hedvig Schwal coming from the Catholic University of Leuven, former director of the Leuven Centre for Irish Studies, founder of EFISIS, the European Federation for Irish Studies. She will be talking about contemporary Irish novels. So we'll get the information out about that. Please come and join us.